givers and receivers. I like to think of myself as the former. Pull your head out the gutter, just talking about this podcast. It's free. My name's Danny Whitaker. This is my own worst enemy, mental health podcast. Right, where to start? Right, okay, if you're one of these people who doesn't appreciate a good preamble, today's episode might not be up your straza, so to speak. Okay, jumping straight in. Today we're talking about emotional freedom technique, or EFT, or tapping, as it's kind of commonly known. And my guest today is Dawson Church, and he's the founder of EFT Universe. So, if you've never heard of EFT or tapping, it's basically a form of alternative medicine which claims that tapping on certain acupuncture points can help relieve various psychological ailments. Now, just to state my position on this form of therapy, I'm skeptical, to say the least. The way I discovered it, though, is I've got this strange habit that whenever I'm sort of on edge or panicky, I kind of massage or tap along my eyebrows, sort of where you can feel that kind of bony monkey ridge across the middle of your forehead. And I sometimes do it so hard that I've got pictures of myself where I look like I've been punched because I've bruised myself doing it. So yeah, I went Googling, see why I do this and why it seems to relax me. And suffice to say, I found this thing called EFT. Now, like I say, it does relax me. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But I don't believe it's down to trapped energy, which seems to be the concept behind EFT. For me, I think it's just kind of a relaxing or painful distraction, depending like how on edge I am and how vigorous I'm doing it. But there's so many people out there who swear by this thing that I thought it was something worth covering. However, now I know I can be self-deprecating in these introductions, and that's kind of my shtick, I suppose. But in this episode, I genuinely fail in my responsibilities as an interviewer. With an issue as contentious as this, it's sort of incumbent on me to play devil's advocate to the best of my abilities. And let's just say I didn't do a very good job of that on this occasion. This is probably my worst performance as an interviewer so far, he says, rubbing his eyebrows. The first half of the interview goes fine, and Dawson raises some really interesting points about things like institutional inertia in academia and this sort of entrenched hostility towards new ideas. But it's about halfway into the interview that things start to go awry, because there's just too many concepts and a priori assumptions being made that I just let slide instead of challenging them or seeking further clarification. And listening back, there's 2 points that stand out for me. So the first one is about 2/3 of the way in. There's a part where Dawson's explaining how EFT is applied to things like trauma and PTSD. And the basic idea is that you have the patient bring to mind the traumatic thought, which activates the stress response. And then at the same time, the person's supposed to tap on their body to send a signal of safety and reassurance back to the brain, so effectively diluting the memory. So to me, that sort of sounded like a form of exposure therapy, similar to the likes used in CBT. So I put it to him that if that's the case, and this is kind of purely cognitive, then what does the concept of trapped energy and meridian points have to do with it? Because it sort of seems superfluous. And then he kind of goes on to talk about the evolutionary origins of the stress response, but he doesn't actually directly address the point about energy and meridians. And when he's done answering, you can sort of hear in my response that I'm clearly dissatisfied with the answer, but I don't challenge him on it. I just sort of skip over it and move on. And then in the next question, I ask if there's any way of disproving this accusation that the efficacy of EFT is purely down to placebo effect. And Dawson's response is that he says there's something like 100 or more clinical trials out there in favour of EFT, but which account for placebo. And at this point, I was already aware of a pretty damning study by two people, Wendy Waite and Mark Holder, which was published in the Scientific Review of Mental Health Practice. And what the study basically involved, there's 122 participants with self-reported specific phobias, and they split them all into four groups. And one was a control group which received no treatment. I think they were put on a waiting list. One group received genuine clinical EFT, as it's supposed to be applied. One received EFT, but tapping on random sort of non-meridian points along the arm. And then the final group were asked to tap on points on a paper doll. And the conclusion of that study was that, this is quoting the study, EFT was no more effective than either a placebo or modelling control procedure. Participants who were instructed to tap on various locations of their arm reported similar reductions in fear as those participants who were instructed to tap on meridian points. The locations of the points did not play a measurable role. Furthermore, participants who tapped on a doll also reported similar decreases in fear ratings. So, knowing about this study, I was sort of curious how Dawson might account for that kind of result. But again, I didn't ask him. And there's a couple of reasons why I didn't tackle these instances a bit more head on. The first, and probably the weakest reason, is that I only booked him for an hour, and it felt like time was running away, and there was just all these other remaining questions I had that I didn't want to have to skip over. But the main reason I didn't want to challenge him was because I didn't want to seem impolite. So, regardless of whether or not I agree with my guests, I genuinely appreciate them taking the time to come and speak to me. And at this stage, I'm just not comfortable being too antagonistic towards people, because I just feel like, how much of a twat do you have to be to ask somebody to appear on your podcast for free and then proceed to effectively insinuate that they're a fraud? And it feels like a tricky dichotomy to navigate, and I'm not entirely sure how to reconcile that. I'm not sure whether the best thing to do with these kinds of contentious topics would be to maybe interview two different people with opposing viewpoints and then release them as separate but complementary episodes, and then just let you guys make your own minds up about who's right. And that way I can remain completely unbiased, if you like. Ideally, I would like to get two people on to debate one another directly, but it's hard enough lining up two schedules, mine and another person's, so, never mind trying to do it for the three of us. It just ain't going to happen. The most disappointing aspect of this whole thing for me, though, is that I think if I would have taken Dawson to task on these points, he would have been happy to push back. And let me tell you why. I contacted a bunch of EFT practitioners for this interview, but unless they were going to be kind of preaching to the choir, none of them were interested. At one point I was having a back and forth with one guy who's one of the most famous EFT practitioners in the world, a huge audience. And all along he was happy to speak to me, and we were talking about getting an interview booked because I hadn't confessed to being a skeptic. But then as soon as I mentioned debating some of the science behind it, all of a sudden his diary was completely full, and it was just, an interview was off the cards. But when I contacted Dawson, I mentioned being a skeptic and having a debate straight off the bat, and he was like, sounds good, let's do it. So yeah, it's kind of on me, this one. This wasn't Dawson being elusive, this was me being too standoffish, I think. So nevertheless, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past and all that. Great Gatsby. Right, anyway, back on track. Let's do the usual introduction. Okay, Dawson Church is a health writer and researcher in the fields of health, psychology and spirituality. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Genie in Your Genes, Epigenetic Medicine and the New Biology of Intention, and the founder of EFT Universe, one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web. He's the editor of the peer-reviewed journal Energy Psychology, general manager of Energy Psychology Press, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. In 2007, he founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare, a non-profit institution dedicated to the study and implementation of evidence-based psychological and medical techniques. In today's episode, we discuss the origins and theory behind EFT, its professed application to the likes of anxiety and PTSD, whether blocked energy is at the cause or effect of psychological distress, and whether or not the positive effects of EFT can be explained away by the placebo effect. Dawson's not on social media, as far as I can tell, but you can visit his website, which is EFTUniverse.com. That's EFTUniverse.com. If you'd like to comment on this episode, you can do so by going to myownworstenemy.org/podcast. And, as always, as much as you can, please enjoy my conversation with Dawson Church. Right, okay, Dawson Church, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Danny, so good to be here.
Right, today we are here to talk about emotional freedom technique, EFT, or tapping. But I think before we dive into it, I'm going to have to do a bit of a preamble on this one. So there's a couple of reasons I wanted to do this episode. The first is I discovered EFT completely by accident. So I have a strange habit of, when I'm feeling anxious, panicky, to tap my eyebrow. Sometimes nice and soft and relaxing, sometimes vigorously to the point where I bruise myself. So I went on Google, as you do with these things, and I just typed in, why does tapping my eyebrow relax me? And then I discovered this thing called emotional freedom technique. So I'll be honest, skeptical. However, in personal, in chats with people, so I run a mental health support group, I've heard a lot of people personally advocating EFT and tapping and saying that they've tried it and that it's worked for them. And also I've seen a lot of positive testimonials about it from people online who swear that it's worked for them. What's interesting for me is, with some of these therapies that lie outside of the mainstream, a lot of them they're talked up by the people, by the practitioners, and you get a lot of printed testimonials that, you know, these quotes and stuff on websites, but actually finding people or patients that have benefited from some of these things, it's harder to do. But with EFT, there's a lot of people out there that swear by it. But with it being a contentious issue, you know, it's a therapeutic method that hasn't been fully embraced, if you like, by the scientific community. It would be remiss of me not to kind of raise some of the concerns about it that are raised by the people who are skeptical of this practice. Of all the people I've invited on the podcast, I'm happy you agreed, because going through your website, you seem to have a particular interest in attempts to scientifically validate EFT. And you even include a section on your website where you publish criticisms that people have made of it, and then you invite people to make up their own minds about either side of the argument, which I think is a very honest approach. Also, one of the the main concerns that critics of this practice have is that people will say people might spend money on EFT, getting EFT guidance, when really they should be seeking out other therapies. Whereas on your website, you can download a manual the EFT mini manual for free, and people can try it themselves. So, like I say, before we go into this, that's not a concern that I have. People are more than welcome to go to your website, download the manual, try it for themselves. There's no need to cancel their existing CBT therapies. There's no need to spend any money. And so, yeah, I think that's a good. I've kind of swept the decks there, I think, going into this.
Well, I love your story about tapping, Danny, because people do tap unconsciously all the time. In fact, when I'm doing a live workshop, a live class, we teach them the tapping points, the acupuncture meridian endpoints in the very first morning. And then we encourage them when they go to lunch. And usually the workshops are in major cities, and people go to a restaurant for lunch in the middle of the day. And I encourage them to look around the restaurant while they're having lunch. And what you can usually see within about 10 minutes, you'll see people sitting at tables and they're tapping. They're unconsciously stimulating these acupressure points. They might be rubbing them, tapping them. They might be using gentle, firm pressure. But people tap these points all the time, and I'll often look around an audience. If I have an audience of say 100 people, I'll look around the audience, I'll just point to people, and then everyone turns around, looks at them, and unconsciously people are tapping and touching these points all the time. And we've been doing this for millennia, as far back as people go. So all EFT does is it recognizes this, and it organizes tapping or rubbing those points into a little routine you can use for stress reduction. But people have been using them for a long time. Now, as far as that progression goes of stories to research, it's a very natural thing to happen. Usually, new discoveries in therapy are not found in the lab or in experiments. They're found by clinicians, they're found by social workers, they're found by life coaches, they're found by psychologists, people who have clients and they care about those clients. They want things that work for those clients, and they aren't that concerned about orthodoxy, so they'll try different things that might work for a client. That's the way most therapeutic breakthroughs happen. It often takes years and years and years and years for that kind of clinical intuition to be validated by research. And so if you look through the history of medicine, you'll find example after example after example of this. You find that aspirin was used for pain relief for a century before we knew anything about how it worked. Quinine was used for treatment of malaria for decades. Penicillin was used for a long time before we had any idea of how it worked. So these observations are made by people who want to help others. And then eventually we do studies and we validate them. But during that early period when there are stories accumulating, when one doctor tells another, when one therapist tells another, when people share those kinds of successes with each other, they're only stories. And one of the problems with our medical model is that we tend to dismiss that in medicine as quote unquote anecdotal. That's just anecdotal, just somebody telling me that. Now, I did a research project in the 1980s on cancer remission, people who'd recovered from terminal cancer. And I heard story after story after story after story about this. And I documented those stories. I recorded them, transcribed them, and it was obvious to me something was going on here. There is one database, actually formal database on this, and it has tens of thousands of accounts of people who've had remission from terminal cancer. And one of the really weird things about that database of stories is we hear these stories, but if you go talk about them in a medical school, you'll usually get the responses, well, it's only anecdotal evidence, and so we don't study those. Personally, if I had cancer, I would be studying every single story for leverage and knowledge about how that person overcame cancer. And yet often we don't pay attention to that wisdom until there's a study. Now, eventually there are studies. There are case histories published in medical journals eventually, and the structured case histories that are credible. Then maybe there are very simple outcome studies where you measure a patient's state before treatment and after treatment. And then you move to the gold standard of research, which is randomized controlled trials, you go beyond that is when you have a pool of those randomized controlled trials, you can combine them into a meta-analysis, and then you have a really convincing picture. And meta-analyses measure what's called a treatment effect, and we can measure this on a continuum from a very small effect to a really large effect. And so you now know from this group of studies what the effect size is of a treatment. But again, that is decades away from those first stories appearing. So every kind of therapy goes through this kind of trajectory. And unfortunately, when those first anecdotes appear, often the critics say, oh, well, it was just placebo. There's nothing happening there. The only reason that this therapy is effective is because of the components it shares with accepted therapies. And so when those first little green shoots of clinical wisdom appear, when a new therapy is first discovered, often the critics pile on and smother it. And so the US government commissioned a report in 2000 on what's called therapeutic innovation, how we make progress in medicine. And that report makes really discouraging reading because they found that 8 out of 10 new therapies don't survive. They're crushed by that criticism. 8 out of 10 good, effective therapies don't make it into practice. They never make it from the lab, from the study stage to the patient because of all of that weight of institutional inertia, all that criticism. And for those that do, for the 2 out of 10 new therapies that actually survive running that gauntlet, they find that it takes an average of 17 years for them to get implemented in a clinical setting like a hospital or a practice room. And so what we're getting when we go into hospital is we're usually getting stuff that's 17 years out of date and only 20% of it. And it's a really discouraging figure. So that we have a system that's really stacked against innovation and heavily biased toward old established therapies. So it's really hard to make a new therapy widely used. And the fact that EFT now is widely used in hospitals and clinics and so on is a miracle. But it's taken 20 years to reach that status. So that's kind of the picture we see here. Is initially there are stories that leads to simple studies, leads to more elaborate studies, then randomized controlled trials. But this whole process can take 15, 20, or even 50 years.
Yeah. Right, I think we've both done a good job of kind of sweeping the board there. So what we can do now is, what I'd like to do is kind of delve into the details because and treat this kind of moving forward as if the listener has like no prior knowledge of EFT. This is the first time that they're ever hearing about it. But I'll tell you what I do before we dive into the details about that is, I suppose, let's start with a very brief explanation of what EFT is, because we've talked about tapping and eyebrows and stuff, and some people might be thinking, hang on, what's going on here? So if you give us a very brief explanation of what EFT is, and then I'm interested in possibly learning a little bit about you and how you came to study this particular field of research.
I'll tell you this in kind of a roundabout way, Danny. When I'm doing a live workshop, I have a little electrical gizmo called a galvanometer, and it's small, it fits in the palm of my hand, but it measures the electrical charge on your skin. And so I get a volunteer up in front of the classroom, and I use my little handheld galvanometer, and I run it over their skin, and it emits a little beeping tone. It's like beep, 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 beep. But when it detects an area with a lot of conductivity, where electrical signals are flowing very easily, it goes crazy. It goes beep, 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 really high-pitched beeping tone. And these points of heightened conductivity are tiny. They're typically less than a millimeter in diameter. And if I move that galvanometer 1 millimeter away, it goes back to that beep, beep, beep tone. So I can use a galvanometer and I can find all of these points in your skin of electrical conductivity where electrical signals travel really rapidly through your skin. And the reason I mention that is that everyone understands, okay, this is just a recording instrument, it's an electrical instrument, it's measuring a physical phenomenon. But then I show them an acupuncture chart, and that acupuncture chart is 2,000 years old, and it shows all of these same points. And so what I marvel at is, sure, now as a modern scientist, I can use an instrument and show you where those acupuncture points are. But 2,000 years ago, in fact, there's evidence that 5,000 years ago, that human beings were using these same points of heightened electrical conductivity for healing. And so EFT does is it simply makes use of this phenomenon. There are certain points on our skin that are highly conductive, that are much less resistant than the surrounding points, and they're shown on ancient acupuncture charts. There are over 300 of them on the body, but they're organized into 14 lines of energy, 14 energy flows, and those are the acupuncture meridians. So each meridian has an beginning and an end, and we typically tap on the end points of 12 of the meridians when we do a tapping routine. And these are the same points that an acupuncturist would use if you're receiving a treatment. So go to have acupuncture, and that acupuncturist is stimulating these points on your body. When you go for acupressure or a shiatsu massage, the acupressurist is then using pressure on those same acupuncture points. With EFT, we're just tapping on those points. What we are doing uniquely with EFT, though, is we're applying it to psychological problems. So, for example, you had a car crash, and the car crash happened 6 years ago, but you're still nervous about driving. Maybe you were bullied in school, and that was 50 years ago, and you're still fearful and suspicious of other people. And even though it's been a long time, you still have this emotional response. So with EFT, we have people remember the bad things in their lives, the crises, the emotional disappointments, all of the setbacks they've had. And while they're vividly recalling an emotionally triggering event, we have them tap on those 12 acupressure meridian endpoints. And what we find happens when they do that is that they rapidly calm down. We do this with people who are in extreme distress. We've had teams, for example, go to Rwanda and work with people in orphanages there whose parents were murdered during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and get a terrible social dislocation in which almost 1 million people were killed. And now their children are 25, 35 years old. We're tapping with those orphans, and their emotional distress is dropping to low levels. We're working with people who were in the Vietnam War or in Iraq or Afghanistan and seeing their numbers go way down. I was writing about 2 clinical trials in Iran that were published in the last couple of years. And one of them was Iranian veterans who were victims of mustard gas attacks by Iraq during the Iraq-Iran War, and doing EFT with them. Not only did they find that their psychological distress went away, but their symptoms from their lung damage went away as well. So we're now showing that not only does tapping on these meridian endpoints have a big effect on your psychological well-being, diminishing levels of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and phobias, we're also showing that it has marked effects on your physiology. So basically, that's what EFT is. It's tapping on these meridian endpoints. Why do you think of the bad things that happen to you? It rapidly removes psychological distress. When psychological distress is removed, physiological changes, beneficial physiological changes happen alongside those psychological shifts.
So how did you personally come to discover this? What was your, because it's Dawson Church PhD. So what were your research interests prior to this? How did you come to discover it? And also, where does EFT specifically come from? Because I know you've mentioned that it's relation to Chinese acupuncture. But if you could tell us a bit, like I say, about your history and the history of EFT in and of itself.
Sure. Well, Danny, my introduction to EFT was from a friend of mine who was a Gestalt therapist, and I trained in Gestalt therapy in the 1980s and 90s, and I really am intrigued by Gestalt therapy. It's a very effective form of psychotherapy, but people make comparatively slow progress in it. Again, it's an excellent kind of psychotherapy, but I was accustomed to seeing people doing Gestalt therapy make incremental progress. A friend of mine who was a therapist told me about this wonderful new technique he discovered called tapping, which was resulting in breakthroughs for his clients, and I thought, no way it could work that fast, because I've been doing therapy. I've been going to therapy classes for 20, 25 years. I've never seen those kinds of rapid breakthroughs. I didn't really believe it. But one day I was working on some distress of my own. I had a property, a small hotel that I needed to sell, and it had gone into escrow a couple of times, and then the deal had fallen apart, and the current deal was falling apart, and I was really nervous about whether or not it would go through. And this therapist friend of mine had given me an instruction sheet showing those endpoint meridians. So I took 5 minutes, tapped on them, and my anxiety level went way down. What I recommend people do is try EFT just one time, because when you're discussing EFT from an intellectual standpoint, it's one kind of experience. When you are feeling it in your body, and you're literally feeling your anxiety or your depression or your traumatic stress disappear, your physical body feeling much better, that's a very different experience. So I recommend people try it that way. And again, these points have been used by people for healing for thousands of years. And so in my book, the EFT Manual, I describe some of the history of EFT and how it was known in human civilization even 5,000 years ago. And the modern renaissance of EFT dates from the 1970s, when acupuncture came to the West. In 1972, President Nixon went to China, the Vietnam War came to an end, and acupuncture invaded the West. And some therapists wonder, I wonder if acupuncture can be used for psychological problems as well as physiological problems. So they began to experiment with acupuncture for psychological issues. One of those therapists was a clinical psychologist named Roger Callahan, and Callahan developed routines for using tapping for various kinds of psychological conditions, and eventually that was simplified, named EFT. And there are a lot of variants of EFT out there, but the version that's been demonstrated in over 100 clinical trials now, we call clinical EFT. That means it's the kind of EFT that's been validated in all of that research. So now there's a lot of research behind EFT. There are several meta-analyses of EFT for depression, for anxiety, for PTSD, and it now has a really sound research base, so it's being accepted, for example, by veterans hospitals. One of the biggest hospital chains in the U.S. Is called Kaiser, and they are about to publish professional guidelines for using EFT for PTSD. So it's making that long march towards acceptance now. But it has a user base of over, we don't know how many exactly, but well over 10 million people worldwide. So it's gone from being this really fringe idea, acupuncture, Eastern medicine, to being widely used, and it's being spread in this kind of grassroots way by people telling people.
Right, okay. So what I think I'd like to do now is kind of move through some of the questions I've got about it, basically, because I remain agnostic, I think, on the topic. I'm not sure where I stand on it. Like I say, my experience of it is, it seems to be, it does relax me, but I'm not sure whether I'm convinced about this idea of like energy fields and meridian points, or whether I just find it a kind of a hypnotic distraction. So the first thing I'm interested about is this idea of these energy fields. So, and I think you alluded to that before with this. What was this instrument you said you used on people's skin?
A galvanometer.
A galvanometer. So is that the galvanometer? Is that what is used to measure whether energy is flowing supposedly the right way or at the correct speed through someone's meridian points? Is that right?
No, it doesn't measure that.
Okay.
It's just measuring the amount of charge on the skin. And so there are areas of our skin with, just for example, if you think about an electrical cable that powers your computer or your stereo or your toaster in your house. So that electrical cable powering your toaster has copper wire running through the middle of it, and that's highly conductive. It also has rubber around the outside of the copper wire, and that is not conductive. That's a resistor that has it's insulation. So insulation is highly resistant, and substances like metal are highly conductive. And so all a galvanometer is measuring is how much conductivity there is at that point on the skin. And acupuncture points have about 1/2000th of the resistance of the surrounding skin. So they're very easy to measure with a device like a galvanometer, but it is measuring energy flow through the meridians. That's a whole separate concept. That's measured by something. There are devices invented in the 1950s by a German named Reinhard Voll, and these electroacupuncture or or bioflow devices are a whole different category of device. And the energy flows are something that's measured in a different way.
So you don't consider this idea of energy flow to be part of this of EFT then? Is that a separate issue? Is that outside of clinical EFT?
It's part of acupuncture. And so what the acupuncturist does, you're going to see that acupuncturist, they'll usually hold your wrist, they'll take your pulse, your acupuncture pulses, and then they'll decide where on your body to insert those acupuncture needles. Now, again, there are over 300 points. How do they decide? Well, they have the expertise to detect where the energy isn't flowing, and so you get that acupuncture needle inserted at that spot. And in acupuncture theory, they're unblocking the energy at that place. You usually then feel much better after a treatment. So that's the concept of energy flow. And as far as measuring that scientifically, there are some interesting studies. Like, for example, at Harvard University, there were some studies done where they would inject a dye, a radioactive dye, at an acupuncture point and then observe how it traveled through the body. And they did find there was some correspondence between that and meridians. There are also more recent studies which look at these acupuncture pathways. They're finding anatomical evidence for tiny ducts running through our veins that correspond to some of these acupuncture pathways. But they're not nearly finding energy flows in acupuncture inside the body is not nearly as easy as measuring it on the skin. And so, just for example, another one of these technologies is EEGs, and we can measure the effects of emotional change using an EEG. Oh, an EEG, by the way, is another example of a device now. I mean, EEGs are ubiquitous. They're used all over the place. We use electroencephalographs to measure brain function. We use electromyographs to measure muscle function. We use electrocardiographs, ECGs to measure heart function. And so the idea that our body has electrical fields that we can measure and use for diagnosis and treatment is just a completely accepted thing in modern medicine. But the guy who actually invented the very first EEG was a German doctor called Hans Berger. And he published his results. He first measured the EEG wave signals in 1926. He published his results in 1928. He showed tracings of alpha and beta waves in the brain. And his invention, his device, was met with absolute hostile, skeptical scorn from others, both in Germany and also in England and the US. And one of his critics wrote that there's absolutely no way that electrical signals can be picked up from the surface of the scalp that are showing what's happening in the brain. He committed suicide 12 years later, and he'd been expelled from his university position. He became depressed. He just killed himself. I mean, the opposition to the notion of an EEG was so widespread at the time. So we forget that these scientific inventions, like MRIs, like SPECT scans, like PET scans, the medical establishment fought these tooth and nail successfully for decades. And so these innovations, some of them eventually do gain ground, but very, very slowly and with great difficulty. So when we can measure these things today, what we forget is that these the pioneers who discovered these things had a really hard time, and getting any kind of new therapy approved and into widespread use for patients is a long, hard slog.
So I'm kind of a bit confused about maybe the cause and effects mechanism at play here. So say if you've got something like, are we saying that anxiety is caused by a block in energy flows, or that anxiety causes the blocks in energy flow? I'm confused about how What's the physiological mechanisms at play? I'll tell you what. Let's use a concrete example. So let's say something like anxiety. What are the physiological mechanisms that are at play, and how do they intertwine with this idea of meridian points?
Danny, that's a great question. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the emotional state that produces the energy state, or the energy state that produces the emotional state? And I don't know that we can say which came first. What we can say is one accompanies the other. And I'll give you a really concrete example, and I'll use the EEG because there are now just, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of EEG studies, and we know what these brainwaves mean. So there are 6 basic brainwaves, and I'll just talk about a couple of them now. The brainwave that is associated with anxiety is beta. And these are beta waves from like 20 to 30 cycles per second. And we know that a person who's anxious is going to have a lot of beta waves all over their brain. So they'll have a high amplitude of beta in their brain. And so is the beta causing anxiety? I think that what you can say is that people who are anxious have high beta. So beta is the signature brainwave of anxiety. If I take that person with a whole bunch of beta and I then tap with them, they'll report their anxiety level going down. So they'll report an emotional shift. What I'll see on the EEG is their beta waves normalize. Also, what I'll see is their alpha waves will then increase. When they are in high beta, I've watched people on the EEG many, many times having this phenomenon. When they're in high beta, when they're anxious, their whole brain starts to conform to that signature of high beta waves, and their alpha can shrink to almost nothing. Their theta and delta, their slowest waves, really important for health. Those waves can almost vanish because just the way their whole mind is consumed by anxiety, their whole brain is consumed in those beta waves. When we relax them, though, we see big flares of alpha, we see their slowest waves, theta and delta, expanding, and we see their beta normalize. A little bit of beta waves, enough to be conscious and function consciously, but without that high anxiety. So it's fascinating now that we can look at the brain's function, see the way the brain is processing information, and see that way the brain's changing shift after people tap.
Yeah, I've got to say, when you take these theories to like the logical conclusion. So I mean, you mentioned PTSD and people who were like the victims of whose family members were the victims of genocide and things like that. And yeah, I mean, PTSD is a good example. You know, some of the like the horrific things that people go through. You know, whether it's somebody's raped or somebody sees somebody murdered and things like that. And you think that all kinds of the kind of physiological stimuli that's going on in that situation, the things that people hear, that they see, that they smell, that the way that somebody's maybe touched, it seems a leap to say that simply tapping on a part of your body is going to eradicate the anxiety brought about from that experience. And I'm just wondering how you could... Is there any way you can kind of reconcile that for me? Because obviously it's such an extreme example. But again, PTSD seems to be one of the things that was cited in a lot of the EFT studies that I read. And I'm just not sure how that works. It seems like there's much more going on there than just a little bit of trapped energy under the skin. Do you know what I mean?
What we know from research is that EFT works particularly well for certain things. Again, EFT works brilliantly for some things, less effectively for other things. But PTSD is one of the problems which EFT shines. And we now know, based on brain function, exactly how it works. When you think of I'll just use that car crash example. And I've worked with many people who had car crashes. So I've seen this happen in terms of treatment many times, but also now we've seen it happen in terms of brain function. And so when somebody remembers the car crash, when they remember the sights, the smells, the burning rubber, they remember there's one one 28-year-old woman I worked with in a recent workshop, and she described how she was putting on her makeup on the way to work, and she dropped her lipstick. And so she reached down to pick it up off the floor of the car, and when she straightened up again, the car in front of her had braked while she was down on the floor. And when she looked up, she realized she couldn't avoid an accident. She hit her brakes, skidded, hit the car in front of her. And so she vividly remembered the screeching of the tires on the road. She remembered the crash of metal buckling, of glass breaking. She had the taste of blood in her mouth, the feeling of being thrown forward. She had many different, these are called aspects in trauma, different aspects, sensory aspects of the trauma. And so we worked with her on each of those sensory memories. And when you remember an event like that, the emotional part of the brain gets highly active. It's called the limbic system. It's in the middle of the brain, also called the midbrain. So the midbrain limbic system becomes highly active. If you have a person in an MRI scanner, and while you're operating the MRI, you tell them to think about the car crash, what you see is that there is a huge amount of activity in the fear centers of the brain, the anxiety centers of the brain. If you have them in an EEG, you'll see a big increase in those high beta waves. If you then tap, that sends a signal to the brain as well, but the tapping is sending a signal of safety. So you're getting the signal. It's very soothing to tap, like you do on your eyebrow. So it's a self-soothing action you're doing. So here your brain is getting two signals. One is saying to your brain, go into fight or flight, danger, huge fear. That's coming from the memory. Then there's a second signal coming to the emotional brain from the tapping. And that signal is relax. So what happens when the brain gets these two signals? One is saying go into fear, go into fight or flight. The other is saying everything's okay. What happens is the brain tends to prioritize the physical signal. When the brain has a mental experience and a physical experience, the physical experience is real. So if you're thinking back to a bad thing that happened, it's just a thought, it's just a memory. But if you're having a physical sensation of safety, if you're sitting there in a nice, safe environment, if you're tapping, if you're getting a massage, if you're having physical signals which clearly tell your body you're safe, then the body realizes that that mental image, that memory, is not a justification to go into fight or flight. So once you break the association between having the memory of the car crash and the emotional midbrain getting lit up, once you break that association one time, it tends to stay broken. That's why EFT is so effective for PTSD. So again, in classic psychological terms, you counter-condition a strongly conditioned response. You've been used to thinking about the accident, and every day you think about the accident. If you think about the accident for 3 years or 5 years or 25 years, then you have this conditioned response of going into fight or flight when you think about the accident. But if you then pair that with a soothing signal, then a process called memory reconsolidation occurs. Now, there's a lot of psychological theory here. This is one of the most exciting new fields of research. It's called memory reconsolidation and extinction. And there's a lot of buzz about this in psychological circles, because psychologists and neuroscientists are realizing that if you can counter-condition that signal of fear, that breaks the association in the brain between remembering the bad thing and going into fight or flight. And once you break that association one time, once you counter-condition that one time, it tends to stay broken for good. So from these neuroscience studies, we now understand exactly how EFT works.
You see, I mean, that makes sense to me, and it sounds similar to exposure therapy, which is, that's gradual exposure to the thing that it is you fear, and eventually you acclimatize to it. And I think there might be something in that's used in OCD that's similar, just like a cognitive sort of exposure therapy, that you can expose yourself to those thoughts, so purely at a cognitive level. That makes sense to me, as does this idea of kind of simultaneously relaxing yourself and sending yourself that opposing signal. But then I guess my question is, so then I don't understand necessarily what these meridian points play in this idea of trapped energy, because that seems like an aside from this kind of cognitive exposure aspect.
Well, they're all different explanatory schemes for an essential body process, which is either becoming more stressed or more relaxed. And we have these multiple systems that are engaged by stress and relaxation. When you're highly stressed, many different things happen. On the neurotransmitter level, typically you have much more dopamine, much less serotonin. When you're highly stressed, typically you have far higher cortisol and far lower amounts of relaxation hormones like DHEA and GABA. So you have a big drop in those types of hormones, big shift in neurotransmitters. On the nervous system side, you have an engagement when you're stressed. You have the sympathetic nervous system highly engaged. When you're relaxed, you have the parasympathetic nervous system highly engaged. And brain waves. The signature brain wave of fear is beta. The signature brainwave of relaxation is alpha. And so this is a whole huge group of shifts happening in your body based on whether you're stressed or relaxed. And they all work together. And they all coordinate together because the stress response, the fear response, was an essential ingredient to our survival. If just imagine two of your ancestors 400,000 years ago. So it's, they're living in the Rift Valley of Africa. These primitive hominids have learned to get enough protein to develop these big brains, and then one of them has a stress response that is a tiny bit faster than the other, a nanosecond faster. And so I write about this in the EFT manual, how we have these genes called immediate early genes, and they're responsible for our stress response. They reach peak gene expression in under 3 seconds. And so you're faced with a tiger and boom, you're making tons of adrenaline, tons of cortisol. The genes that code for those stress hormones click on. And so your nervous system is in high gear. Suddenly you're in high sympathetic nervous system mode. You have lots of dopamine to allow you to be alert and escape from danger. Your cortisol, your adrenaline spike. You have a lot of beta, and you have a huge amount of focus in your biological systems in getting you out of danger. And so that kind of ability to get stressed is highly useful and highly adaptive. And that's what enabled us to survive back then. So if you had two people and one had a gene mutation that allowed them to get stressed a nanosecond faster, they were the one that survived and passed that mutation on to their progeny. So generation after generation, you find that we've been bred with the fight or flight response to have a better and better and better ability, generation after generation, for thousands of generations, to get stressed. Now, we're really good at getting stressed. So now we just have a thought about a bad thing, and suddenly our blood pressure rises, our cortisol spikes, all of these same things are happening in our bodies, just thinking about the bad things that might happen, but probably won't. But again, the evolutionary penalty for failing to notice, if you made a mistake and you didn't notice the tiger in the grass 400,000 years ago, you were dead. So that kind of mistake was fatal. If you made the mistake of thinking there might be a tiger in the grass, or thinking about the tiger in the grass and there wasn't one, there was no evolutionary penalty for that kind of mistake. So we've learned, in terms of our cellular learning and the way our bodies function, to be acutely aware of problems in our environment. And that's the way we've survived as a species. And so we have this huge amount of recruitment of biological resources. Whenever we have a stressful thought, a stressful feeling, immediately all of these things start to happen in our bodies. And the reason we are that way is that's how we survived in years gone by. So the very stress response that enabled you to survive in ancient times, that enabled your ancestors to breed, now is really counting against you.
Right. Okay. Right. I think we are running short on time, Dawson. So I think a few kind of just remaining questions I've got. So the one is, it seems a common accusation for EFT is that it's pure placebo effect. I'm just interested if there's any way in disproving that, really, that it's not purely placebo.
Well, you can read all of the research, again, over 100 clinical trials at my website. It's research.eftuniverse.com. I shall give you a better link where you can find all of the studies as well as the EFT mini manual, which is just my website, dawsongift.com. So at dawsongift.com, you can get a link to read all the research. But again, if you can read over 100 clinical trials, many of which are randomized controlled trials, which account for placebo, then it's hard to make the argument that it's placebo when you've tested it against placebo and found that it's better. So when you have 10 trials that show it's dramatically better than placebo, and then 20, and then 40, and then 100, it's the ability to have any traction behind the argument of this placebo. I don't know. I find that a very hard argument to make myself. I mean, how do you prove 100 clinical trials showing it's not placebo? How do you prove them wrong?
So I tell you what, Dawson, it is where there's a couple of things that I stumbled across in various EFT literature where it starts to get a little bit out there. One of the concepts was, one was people saying that, like, tapping for wealth. So you use EFT to bring money into your life. And another one was this idea of surrogate tapping, where you can tap for somebody else. Now, I'm interested in what you think of those ideas, because, I mean, even if we take everything that you said and which is kind of trying to cement it in very concrete physiological mechanisms, this idea of, like, surrogate tapping seems to be taking it one step too far for me. I'm just interested in what your opinion is on that.
There's an excellent scientific paper on this by a clinical psychologist called David Feinstein, and he wrote the paper on the phenomenon of surrogate tapping. And he put out a call for case histories and wound up finding 100 of them that were credible examples of surrogate tapping, where people tapped for somebody else. And it's like distant healing, distant prayer, distant intention. And he found that there was an effect. What we don't understand, so this is one of those cases where we observe the effects, and the explanatory scheme for those effects we don't know yet. Like, how does it happen? That it does work over distance. Distant healing, for example, is very well documented. How does it work over distance? That's something that science hasn't yet shown. As far as tapping for wealth goes, there are several stories in my book, the EFT Manual, about this. And one investor, for example, was a successful investor in stocks. And what he found after tapping was that he was making more rational and less emotion-driven decisions. And there's a famous saying that on Wall Street, in stock trading, the two most prominent emotions are fear and greed. But both of those will interfere with your ability to think rationally. So after tapping, he was able to reduce his level of emotional stock trading and made much more rational stock trades and much better stock trades. So in terms of tapping for wealth, in terms of tapping for relationships, in terms of tapping for what you want, you'll tend to have wiser judgment when you aren't driven by your anxieties, your fear, and your history.
Okay. Before I let you throw a few links out there for the listeners, my final question is this. I think it's an important one. I've met and spoke to a lot of very passionate psychiatrists. It's a profession that gets bashed a lot, and that people are just out there to try and make money, and they don't really care about the patient. And that's not necessarily been my experience. I've met a lot of people that really do care about people, and that's almost their sole motivation for being involved in that profession. And I'm just wondering why, what do you think would be somebody's motivation for opposing a practice like EFT when they are so passionate about just helping people?
That's a very good question. Because you look back, and Ignaz Semmelweis, who promoted washing hands in the General Hospital in Vienna, where he worked, Vienna, Austria, in the 1860s, and again, he was hounded out of his job and eventually was beaten to death in a mental asylum. But he wanted people to wash their hands. That was his crime. So he was fiercely opposed. I mentioned Hans Berger, who committed suicide 12 years after he first discovered the EEG because of the intense professional opposition from his colleagues. If you look at the history of medicine, unfortunately, virtually every new advance has been just passionately opposed by people in those professions. Not only that, when the people like James Lister, who developed Listerine, who developed the whole idea of antisepsis, of using carbolic acid to sterilize surgical instruments, he was opposed at first himself as well. But he fought a really long and ultimately successful battle to have antisepsis become the norm in hospitals worldwide. He eventually became president of the Royal Society. So here he was this pioneer facing a lot of opposition for being an innovator, but eventually reaching the pinnacle of success, became president of the Royal Society. When he became president of the Royal Society, from that pinnacle of success, he vigorously opposed all new innovations in medicine. It's just one of those things, So we get entrenched. You learn things in medical school, you learn things in your psychology certification, and then you tend to stick with what you know. We don't have a good system for introducing people to new knowledge, and so we tend to repeat the things we learned early on in our careers. And there, people sometimes say to me, is there a big conspiracy among drug companies to suppress these new therapies? And I really don't believe there is. I don't think it's that much of a kind of a dark cabal of people trying to suppress them. I think it's just institutional inertia. We're used to thinking in terms of the alchemists try to turn lead into gold. We look for the magic bullet to cure cancer. We look for the magic drug to take care of a disease. And so that's part of the magical thinking we just have as part of our psyche in human beings. That plus the way we do things, tending to be the way we keep on doing things, means that it's very hard to innovate. In Silicon Valley, with televisions, with cell phones, with computers, there's this frantic pace of innovation. Oddly enough, when it comes to our bodies, our psychological, our physical health, we tend to take exactly the opposite approach and stick with the leeches, So it's one of those rather sobering things about psychology and medicine, Danny. We don't have the same pace of improvement we have in electronic technology, and unfortunately, literally billions of people suffer as a result.
Yeah, well, I've got to say, Dawson, I came in agnostic, and I think, in all honesty, I'm leaving agnostic. But what I will say is that I think it's important that anyone that's suffering, that their loyalty remains to themselves and not to any particular school of thought. And so if you think that EFT can help you, like I say, Dawson's got free resources. There's videos on YouTube which you can learn how to do it. And like I say, it's not doing any harm to try these things if it works for you. Dawson, have you got any links you'd like to recommend? And are you on social media?
The main link to go to is my website, dawsongift.com. Just my name, DAWSON, gift.com, because on dawsongift.com you can download the EFT mini manual, you can get access to our weight loss program, our relationships program, all of our certified practitioners, our classes. So on that one link, dawsongift.com, you get access to all of those free resources. And then again, try it, just download the EFT manual, try it for yourself, and you'll know within a few seconds whether or not it's working for you.
Okay, perfect. Dawson Church, thank you very much.
Danny, thanks again.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode and you've got a couple of minutes to spare, then maybe you'd consider leaving us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. That'd be greatly appreciated. It also encourages other people to give us a listen. If you can't spare a couple of minutes, but you've got a couple of seconds, maybe you could share one of our episodes with your family or friends on social media. Don't forget you can comment on any of these episodes by going to myownworstenemy.org/podcast. And if you'd like to contact me, You can email me at danny@myownworstenemy.org, or if email's a bit old-fashioned for you, then you can get hold of me on all the different social media channels at Danny D. Whitaker. And that's about that. I'll see you again next time.